Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video, and this is another JxmyHighroller reaction, and this is actually an older video that I've never seen before. It was suggested in my my commentary reaction to yesterday's video, and I saw it suggested, and I thought it could be an interesting one. Again, it's a video that I've not done, and I see the like to dislike ratio, and with JxmyHighroller, he usually has like sort of people just seem to like enjoy his videos whether they agree or not. He doesn't seem to get the sort of the dislikes, I guess you could say. So this one I'm seeing a lot more dislikes than I usually would. So maybe this is like a touchy subject. And I mean, let's just see his pinned. Thanks for tuning in, brothers. I know this is a spicy topic, so hang around until the end and let me know your thoughts. Okay, so it is like a sort of touchy subject. Let's give this a watch. Again, I'm just here to sort of see what he's got to say. I love his videos and the sort of stats and things he brings up. But I'm here as a neutral, right? So don't hate me for maybe agreeing or disagreeing with what he says. But I'm just here to learn, man. So let's check this out and see what he's got for us. Interesting.
Back in the 80s and 90s, the NBA had real defense. Defense that today's players would never be able to handle.
So he's going against today's players?
Or at least, that's what we're told.
So he's not. Okay, so he's not. He's going against the grain. I guess people think like that the older generation and the older sort of era of basketball, the defense was harder. But again, I feel like he's going against the grain of this one because he said that at the start, and now he's instantly said, "Oh, maybe that's wrong." This is going to be. I can see this is going to be touchy then.
What's up, everybody? It's Jimmy, and who remembers the good old days of the NBA when players could talk trash, shove each other around, and refs couldn't care less? When taking it into the paint meant you were going to war and not the free throw line. Back when players would take pride in their defense. When real men played the game the way it was meant to be played.
Sorry for pausing again. Is there like any videos out there that I could do of like the fights from like the NBA in the 90s or the 80s, or like just sort of how the league was? Because looking at this, there seems a lot of like sort of, it just seems heated, man.
Sorry.
Now,
clips. There is definitely some truth in this. Prior to the era of basketball we are currently in, that began sometime in the late 2000s, basketball was played a bit differently. And before that era, the game looked a little different, and so on and so on. But it wasn't until this current era that we saw a shift in physicality. I touched on this briefly in my last video. What the league considers a foul today isn't the same as what the league considered a foul 30 years ago. These days, getting to the line doesn't require nearly as much contact. In fact, half the time getting to the line today doesn't require any contact at all. And because of this change, we now get former NBA players saying things like this.
Physically, it was a much more physical game than what it is today. You know, you couldn't walk across the lane without getting checked. You know, or the screens, you know, illegal screens, holding. You always had to pay a price.
And this.
Now, I know they have to protect the players, and I understand that. But now it's just like if you push someone, next thing you know, you get ejected from the game. It's just a hard foul, and it's just, the game is a little bit softer than I like. It's a totally different game. It was, I hate to say it, I'm gonna say it, it was a man's game back then.
We also get old heads across the web speaking up on any post about LeBron, Curry, Harden, and virtually any current superstar saying they would never be able to cut it if they were in a past era of the NBA.
Wow.
And many NBA fans agree with this. This shift didn't happen overnight, but it changed really drastically, really quickly. The rule that changed everything: no more hand checking. According to basketball experts and fans around the globe, the NBA's introduction to the handshake rule was the beginning of the end of defense in the NBA. Most people will go as far as saying players that played prior to this rule would have a field day in today's NBA, that they would score with ease because this rule, along with a few others, has made scoring today a lot more easier than it was back then. But how much truth is there to this statement? I mean, handshaking certainly made things more difficult, right? Well, it's complicated. First, the idea that handshaking was completely legal and happened all the time in the prior era is a myth in itself. In 1979, the NBA clarified the definition of handshaking and abolished the form of defense from the NBA altogether. Clarification added to prohibit handshaking through rigid enforcement, allowing a defensive player to retain contact with his opponent so long as he does not impede his opponent's progress. So, since 1979, it has been completely illegal to handshake players in the NBA. Don't believe me? Here are a few
So
examples of
even before this era,
handshaking
then.
clearly and immediately being called as a foul back in the 90s.
Jordan, hand check foul. Willie.
So this is a myth then, okay.
The left of your screen. 3 seconds. Jordan is fouled by Gerald Wilson.
That is interesting as hell.
Brian Williams in the hands of
So what I'm gathering is the perception of it is it was like this was a thing back when they were playing, but from like what he said, this rule like was in place from the like early 80s and the late 70s. So I mean, that is interesting.
And another hand check.
VJ. Through a whistle.
And I didn't even see anything there.
There we have it.
But let's say for the sake of this argument, handshaking was completely legal in the 80s and 90s.
Okay.
As most of you know, prior to the handshaking rule, players on defense supposedly had full freedom to get in an offensive player's grill, reach and swipe at the ball, literally push up against their opponent whenever they felt like it. And if you've ever played against someone that defends like this, it's annoying, it's frustrating, but most importantly, it's difficult to counter. But when you take a closer look at the numbers, they don't reflect this same notion at all. The 80s are widely considered to be the most physical era in NBA history. Now, within that decade, teams averaged 109 points per game. In the 1990s, NBA teams averaged 101 points per game, and in the 2000s, NBA teams averaged only 97 points per game. The handshake rule was clarified, redefined, and re-implemented in 2004, and according to most fans, this is when defense lightened up and scoring became exponentially easier. Yet, in the 2000s, teams were scoring less than ever before. People will swear that defense was much tougher in the 1980s and 1990s, and yet throughout those decades, there was much more scoring than any other period in modern NBA history. But maybe it's because players back then were just better at putting the ball in the hoop. So what about players that played before and after the handshake rule? If fans are right about this rule, then these players that played before and after the handshake rule should have seen a significant increase in offensive output after the rule came into effect.
Oh, wow.
Well, to find out, I took a look at every player that made the All-Star team in 2003 and took a close look at their numbers. These are players that reached their peak right around the time that the handshake rule came into effect. Some of them later in their careers, some early in their careers. But for the most part, players that had great years before and after this rule. Out of the 21 All-Stars that season, 18 of them had a higher points per game average when handshaking was allowed, and only 3 players had a higher points per game average after the handshaking rule was established. Out of the NBA's top 21 players that transitioned from a handshaking NBA to a non-handshaking NBA, 86% scored far more before the rule was put into effect. But how can this be?
Context is very important.
If what we've all assumed is correct, then scoring should have become easier once handshaking was forbidden. Yet, this isn't the case. Former players like Jim Jackson, Paul Pierce, and Jalen Rose are all now analysts. Now, while on their shows, they swear by the fact that scoring pre-handshake rule was much harder. Those were the days when real men played. Yet, every single one of them averaged more points during the handshaking era.
This is really wild then. What the hell? So like, this just seems to be like a sort of this seems to be like an opinion that's not actually like been studied or anything like that. Maybe there's other stats that sort of back it, but themselves as pundits saying that it was easier, like it's now easier, it was easier beforehand, or it was harder beforehand. Like these stats are just contradicting what they say. So it is interesting seeing that. This is crazy then. So it seems to be like a sort of a public opinion that may not actually be correct.
Era than after. They all say handshaking and physical defense made things much more difficult, but there's really nothing to back up this claim. In fact, listen to this clip of Steven Jackson speaking on LeBron James and the current state of NBA physicality.
Considering how LeBron is not hitting the floor on going up for layups and dunks, considering how easy it is to him, you got to go with LeBron. Nobody's making it difficult for him. It looks like to me that nobody's even trying to stop him. That's how easy it looks. But I come from an era where big men didn't mind getting dunked on. It's a part of the game. You're playing against the best players in the world. You're going to get dunked on. But nobody's challenging them. Nobody's bumping him. Nobody's trying to get him out of his game. Like, all that's a lost art of the game. And I'm not saying be dirty. but it's a part of a part of physicality of the game that's not in the game no more. And if it's not, LeBron's going to average triple doubles for the next 4 or 5 years.
Now, this is one of Steven Jackson's favorite lines. I come from an era when, followed up by some statement that may or may not be true. But pause. Steven Jackson was drafted just 3 seasons before LeBron and retired in 2014. They played in the same exact era. LeBron played 1 season within the handshaking era and averaged 21, 6, and 5 as an 18-year-old.
That is absurd.
I'm pretty sure he would have done just fine within that era. And that is precisely the problem with most statements regarding handshaking and physical defense. Was physical defense an inconvenience? Yeah. Was handshaking an inconvenience? Yes. But did it actually make scoring the ball more difficult? Well, according to most metrics on the topic, no. In fact, I've always thought to myself, if someone has to grab a player, tackle them to the floor, and wrap them up every single time they take it inside, wouldn't that just mean that they're bad at defense? So they have to resort to just imposing their physicality on other players? I mean, we've all been there before. What do most hoopers do when they can't stop you from scoring? More times than not, they just get overly physical with you. Now, there's nothing wrong with this. No one enjoys watching players get to the line simply because they were mildly grazed on their pinky toenail. But good defense and physical defense are 2 different things. Which brings me right into my next point. These days, we are often reminded of how incredibly brutal defense was in the 80s and 90s. We see clips of Jordan getting absolutely wrecked by defenses and half the time not even getting a call. But highlight tapes never actually do the actual game justice. So I chose a completely random game from Michael Jordan's days against the Pistons and recorded every single time he was sent to the line just to see how physical these fouls actually were and what it took to get a foul call back then. Alright, let's take a look at these fouls. Okay, a little hand action there.
Okay.
Didn't really see anything there, but okay. Didn't really see anything there. Maybe a little body contact, I guess. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Alright. That's a tough foul. I'll give him that. That was a tough foul. And a little late game foul. Alright. But maybe this game, the Pistons took it easy on Jordan. So to have a bigger sample size, let's look at the fouls Scottie Pippen drew throughout this same game. Okay. Well, other than the bump on the offensive rebound, didn't see much there. Okay, definitely got him on the arm that time. Alright. I guess that can go either way. Okay, pretty average foul. And another pretty average foul. Again, maybe
You can tell that he's so like unbiased, which is why I take his opinions like pretty like fairly, because I don't think he's got no agenda against the older decades of like, or the older eras of basketball. Like, you can tell from his videos, he just loves the sport. So when you're sort of seeing him sort of give these perspectives, it does sort of open your eyes a bit, because again, I can tell he's not biased whatsoever to like any of these eras whatsoever. So I mean, yeah, it is interesting, and these sort of fouls, you see them happening nowadays. So this game, there was that one on Jordan, to be fair, but I mean, other than that, they seem like pretty comparable. And then that one that happened to Jordan, that sort of stuff does happen in the NBA nowadays as well. It just sort of depends what game. But maybe with what he says, this game they were just sort of light on the players. I don't know. But yeah, this is an interesting, this is a really interesting, like, sort of, just a thing to look at. I'm really enjoying this one.
a hard foul here or there, but nothing nearly as bad as what is always being told regarding this era. And it's not like I cherry-picked these clips. This is every single foul Jordan and Pippen drew throughout this entire game. This Pistons team is considered by many to be the most physical team of all time.
Okay.
And these are the fouls they were giving out in the Eastern Conference Finals. I'm just not seeing that brutal physicality everyone talks about.
That does add something
I've
to
seen
it,
enough of the NBA defenses and how they've changed to tell you that, first off, in the 1980s, the defense was overrated. There was a bit more physicality because the rules allowed it. But today, the athletes are faster and better overall from top to bottom. The elite level athletes of today are not better than the elite level athletes of any era, the 80s or 90s. But overall, from top to bottom, the athletes are better today because the training is better. So I think that it's good that people go back and they look at things for themselves. And all of us have a tendency to do this. That's why everyone has to be checked and balanced in their appraisals, because oftentimes we have a bad habit of trying to romanticize the past, oftentimes erroneously. Another thing is cats, who are in my age range, stop trying to overinflate and overhype every aspect of the NBA back in the 80s and 90s.
Now, don't get me wrong. Was the game more physical back then than it is now? Without a doubt. Players took it inside more, and for the most part, players were much tougher back then. But the way people describe how physical the game actually was in that era is vastly exaggerated. And again, more physical doesn't mean more difficult. But the most important aspect to this myth is something that is overlooked time and time again. A rule change that shifted the way the game is played to this very day. A rule that was actually removed from the NBA in 2001 that made scoring the ball much more difficult than ever before. And that is illegal defense. Prior to 2001, the NBA had a rule regarding what they considered to be illegal defense. This rule was very strict and prevented a lot of defensive techniques that we see today. Players couldn't hedge screens, they couldn't shift over and dig out on big men when they were in the post, they couldn't play halfway defense on rotations by picking and choosing who they wanted to focus on, no double teaming a player on the weak side, and no zone defense. You either had to guard your man or 100% commit to a double team. For example, take a player like Ben Simmons. In today's league, while Simmons is outside, his defender can sag off of him and basically play rover for as long as he wants, hip-hopping around until Simmons gets within his range. But during the illegal defense era, whoever is guarding Ben Simmons has to step up and actually guard him or risk violation. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but let's use the Bucks as an example. If Giannis Antetokounmpo played in the 90s, all the Bucks would have to do is clear out on the weak side and allow Giannis to abuse his defender and race at the basket. The defensive players would be forced to follow their man outside too far away to help, even if the player they're guarding isn't an outside threat. The only other option is to double team Giannis and again, leave your man completely open. Here's an example. Jordan is isolated on the left post and getting into his moves. As he's doing this, a Knicks player at the top of the key comes down to offer help. This was illegal, called a technical foul, and the Bulls were awarded a free throw and the ball.
Straight here at home. That's regular season and playoffs. Illegal defense call.
In case the officials needed some help, he's pointing that the guy that's illegal is right there, John Starks. He is below the foul line, across the front of the rim, and he's not double teaming anybody. That's illegal.
Check this one out. Jordan's got the ball in the corner. Pippen runs across the top of the key and clears out way on the opposite side of the court. But his man doesn't follow and instead hangs out down low to help in case Jordan drives. Today, this happens all the time. But back in the 90s, this was illegal defense. Pippen notices this, tells the ref, and the Trailblazers get an illegal defense violation.
Man, it's crazy how the sport changes in so many different areas.
Here's another one. Poor little Muggsy Bogues gets caught outside on a mismatch with Jordan. Robert Parrish recognizes this, and instead of following his man outside on the opposite side of the court, he hangs out down low. This is immediately recognized as illegal defense, and the Hornets are called for the violation.
With Muggsy on him, look at this.
Look at the difference in height, man.
Parrish is illegal. Parrish is illegal. Now he gets out.
That is mad.
Now, at the time, NBA players loved this. It opened up the court for them to work on offense and prevented Help D from shifting over and impeding on their progress. In an interview with Kicks magazine in 2003, Tracy McGrady, Kevin Garnett, and Tim Duncan all expressed their hatred for the new shift in defensive rules. When asked if they could get rid of one rule within the league, they all said without a doubt, zone defense. I think it puts players that are really good at a disadvantage. It makes it hard for a guy like me. It makes it hard for all of us. It's tough on all of us, it really is. When you're trying to make a move and you got another guy just sitting there on the same side just waiting. He ain't even playing his man. Even Michael Jordan, who played 2 NBA seasons with no illegal defense, said he couldn't stand the change. I never liked zones. I felt like that was a lazy way to play defense, and with them, you can eliminate a lot of the stars making things happen. Here is a clip that demonstrates how drastic this change immediately shifted how the game is played and made offense exponentially harder. In this clip, Dwayne Wade has the ball at the top of the key and is looking to get in some sort of ISO situation. Shaq is on the right block posting up. In the past, the Heat could have simply cleared out and D Wade would have had a true ISO situation. But after the illegal defensive rule was removed, look at how 2 defensive players can literally just sit in the paint and help out. By not having to guard either men in the corner, there are 2 players guarding Shaq and another player ready to help out in case D Wade drives. Other than the players guarding D Wade and Shaq, not one player on the Suns is within 8 feet of their man. Now, you want to know how to combat Help D, switching, and zone defense? Threes, and more threes. People wonder why the league has shifted so heavily to three-pointers.
Crazy, man.
Well, you tell me. Would you rather fight through a double team, a switch, and 2 bigs meeting you at the rim, or use a screen and put up an easy 3 off the dribble? So, which defensive scheme really makes scoring more difficult? Hand checking and physical D, or zone defense? And this is exactly why the hand checking made scoring much more difficult and old school players would have a field day in today's NBA. Myth needs to be put to rest. Not only has hand checking literally been illegal since 1979, but the league only got rid of hand checking altogether as a direct response to zone defense. It only took the NBA 3 years to realize the removal of illegal defense made scoring the ball so difficult that teams and stars around the league were scoring less points than ever before. Thus the introduction, clarification, and establishment of the no hand checking rule. But for one reason or another, this is never addressed. Did hand checking really make scoring back in the 80s and 90s much more difficult? Or did the removal of illegal defense in 2001 make scoring more difficult? Let me know in the comments below. If you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. We are doing this every single week. And as always, until next time.
Firstly, I'm not going to lie. I mean, you look at the clips from the 80s, the 90s, and even earlier than that, and you just see like the fights breaking out and sort of like the fighting and all the just like how just like, again, maybe like context is important and maybe people look back and think it's a lot more than it was, but you still see like how brutal it was in sort of areas. And I do want to do a video on that, man. I don't know if there's even one out there, but like just doing a video focused on like how the league was, the sort of culture of it, etc. I really enjoy that. Again, I don't know if there's anything like that out there, but like people used to just fight about everything and I love it. It just seems like, and that's just the thing of sport. All sports have evolved. It's not just a basketball thing. All sports have evolved. Like I know people look at soccer as a sport that's just full of like diving and flopping, etc. And that's completely fair because like it is a lot less contact than it used to be. But like 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and I'm looking back a long time, the sport was just so different. And like the same with basketball. Like basketball is still like a very physical sport, I'd say, just not as physical as it once was. And it's just how sport is. Like I wonder like how American football has evolved. Like because American football is obviously such like a really physical sport, like where contact is basically what it's based on. So like, has that sport softened up at all? Like, is the sport still the same? Because in that one, you need the contact to sort of make the sport right. But like, it's just interesting to me like how sports evolve, but how all sports in general do just seem to be getting less physical and like less sort of like, I guess less physical is the right word, to be honest. Like, you're not allowed to do certain things. Like, the rules are getting tighter, basically. You know, I wouldn't say less physical, because I think like the actual actor in terms of athletes nowadays, like because of the training and because of the nutrition, athletes are at the best that we've ever seen them. Like in general, like obviously there was anomalies from the past with the MJs, etc. But like, it is just interesting, like seeing how things change in terms of rules, like how it's changed like the sports and how it looks. Back in my day, we had to walk up the hill both ways through the snow just to get the rim. Just saw an interview where Wilt says Jordan 0 is soft and he averaged 60, 70. Every player is going to argue that rule set was tougher. Exactly, man. That's so true. Like, Wilt saying that about Jordan, Jordan must be like, what are you on about? But then Jordan saying that about, let's say, Kobe would be like, what are you on about? Because even though they sort of interchanged, Kobe was a bit later. And then Kobe saying that to LeBron. Like, it's just they all would have these arguments, although they sort of interchanged of eras. It is just like one of those things that's always going to be there, and it's the same with other sports. Like, we get this argument with soccer all the time. Like, we always look back at the older players from like the 70s, the 80s, and 90s with such like sort of love, and like just we sort of hold them in higher regard than maybe we should do, and rightly so, right? Because they are legends of the sport. But it's just human nature, I guess you could say, like the loyalty that you have for that. But hopefully you guys enjoy this again. I know this may be controversial, but it's just a fun one that I felt like I should do, because I feel like these videos are just interesting. Like, people seem to enjoy my JxmyHighroller reactions, and I love doing them as well. So I'm definitely down to do more if people want them. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Until next time, like, subscribe, peace.